emotions are like trying to get rid of your arm. You can't get rid of your arm. You can't get rid of your emotions. No matter how hard we try, again, me from my entire life, minus 5 years ago, stuffing, avoiding, stewing, and brooding, that's been how I've lived my life in terms of emotions. Again, I've pretended that my arm doesn't exist. So I love that when he said that, I just thought that was such a powerful analogy. So for me, I've tried to pretend I don't have arms and live life without having arms. But here they are. I've got my arms right in front of me. So he said emotions are like trying to avoid or ignore your emotions is like trying to avoid or ignore the fact that you've got arms. What is going on, EQ gangsters? Excited about sharing the episode today with you all. It is going to be about a conversation that I had with a psychologist, a legit PhD psychologist. He's been a practicing psychologist now for, I want to say maybe 10 to 15 years now. And he's actually a purple belt, in jiu-jitsu, at Prime Jiu-Jitsu where I train at. And he had heard one of my other podcast episodes from Mentor Podcast with John Herrera and John Roy. And he's like, dude, let's get together sometime. And so we did. And it was great chat. He's got tons of wisdom, super dude. And I'm actually going to be interviewing him very soon on the podcast, so you guys will get a chance to kind of meet him personally. Thank you all so much for watching our YouTube channel, EQ Gangster, listening to our podcast, EQ Gangster, and again, for checking out our website, eqgangster.com. If you are interested in being a part of a community, an active, growing community that are all pursuing growth in the area of emotions, getting healthier emotionally, and almost as part of an emotional fitness program, join our membership at eqgangster.com/mafia. eqgangster.com/mafia. Thank you for reviewing, sharing, subscribing, rating our podcast, our YouTube channel. Totally appreciate it. If there's an episode that really resonates, again, thank you for sharing that with maybe some of your friends or colleagues as well, as we try to get the word out on the importance of emotional health and emotional healing. So here's the conversation. And some of these thoughts, I was taking notes while he and I were talking. So some of the thoughts may seem unrelated. Just know that it was all part of a conversation. There are enough thoughts in here, though, that will hopefully trigger some additional thoughts in yourself for you to pursue more deeply, just kind of to do some exploration and reflection yourself about these things. So this is kind of the opening, how he started. So when we sat down, went to Fuzzy's Tacos, and he said, "No, I listened to a few of your different podcast episodes in EQ Gangster, and you talked a number of times about the 4 deadly sins of emotions: stuffing, avoiding, stewing, and brooding." He said, "I want to just give you another thought, another angle, another thing to chew on," which I love. I love learning. I love it, right? So I'm like, man, give it to me. I'm stoked, right? So I busted out my phone, get ready to take notes. And he said, he's like, my thoughts are that stuffing and avoiding leads to stewing and brooding. Stuffing and avoiding can lead to stewing and brooding. And so we started to have a conversation about that. And then he said, unpleasant emotions represent unmet needs. Unpleasant emotions. So that's kind of thought number 2. Unpleasant emotions represent unmet needs. Now, for those of y'all that are watching on YouTube, I am reading through my notes here, going through my notes. So if you see me looking down and making some notes, that's what I'm doing. So, and then thought number 3, he said that it can be that stuffing and avoiding can come from shame. Stuffing and avoiding can come from shame. So of course I'm loving this, right? So I'm like, oh man, I got to think about this, because I got to look at my own origin story of my emotional foundation, which is our childhood. That's where we all, get our emotional foundation from. And so, and just figured, okay, is that where my stuffing and avoiding comes from? Does it come from shame? So then he said, oftentimes shame can come from my own value, which can come from performance. So that'd be thought number 4, that performance is somehow connected to shame or lack of performance. That if I'm not always doing something, to earn my value, so to speak, that can lead to shame. Now, again, for those of us with a faith background, my particular faith, again, I love Jesus, and Jesus is my Lord and Savior. I have lived much of my life with a performance-based relationship and identity, rather than coming from a place of my identity coming from my relationship with Christ, which is not good. It's not good for me, based on my faith, to come from a performance-based relationship, because that's not even biblical. That's not biblical that my relationship should be based on performance and not my identity coming from Christ alone. So I definitely have lived much of my life with a performance-based identity. Now, consciously, I would never say that. I would say, oh man, are you kidding me? I am so close to the Lord, and I have such a great relationship with the Lord. Not even realizing, because I had no self-awareness at the time, that really my real relationship with the Lord was really based on how well I was performing, how much I was performing. I had a very legalistic relationship with the Lord. I was like a modern day Pharisee or Sadducee, very legalistic, very rule-based, law-based was my view, was where I was at with, my faith early on. Fortunately, I'm not like that anymore. And then thought number 5, he said the cure for shame. So think about that. What is the cure? What do you think the cure for shame is? He said that the cure for shame is vulnerability. The cure for shame is vulnerability. Which again, right? Each of these thoughts, he's dropping some bombs on me, right? I'm like, oh man, I'm loving this. He's just great, deep thoughts. And so, he mentioned that vulnerability is allowing yourself to be seen and still be loved, by those in your life. And I think overall, I'm very transparent, and I'm very vulnerable. Well, hence, listen to this. If you've listened to more than one episode of this podcast, I think you may agree with me. I'm fairly comfortable sharing the junk in my trunk. I'm not proud of sharing the junk in my trunk. I'm not like, oh, I can't wait to share all my failures necessarily. That's not necessarily where I'm coming from. But if someone else can learn from my failures, I want, if that's going to help somebody, then I want to share it. May not be comfortable for me necessarily, but if it's going to add value to somebody, I will do so. So vulnerability would be thought number 6. That vulnerability is allowing yourself to be seen and still allow yourself to be loved. How would you define vulnerability? How would you define shame? Couple thoughts there. Another thought, number 7. Thought number 7 is we should not ever compare suffering. We should not ever compare suffering. I just went to a PTSD class. Again, if you've been listening to my podcast, you know I'm seeing a therapist, counselor lady. I don't even know what her title is, to be honest with you. Somehow she's related to the VA. And you know, and so in this PTSD class, there are like legit combat veterans. One guy is from Vietnam, spent a year and a half, 2 years in Vietnam, came back and Americans spit on him. Those folks that were in Vietnam just came back and just treated like third-class citizens. And I thought, man, I just can't even imagine. And although we're living in a cancel culture, that if you, in fact, this is what I'm ashamed to even say this. I'm sad even sharing this. In the neighborhood I live in, if you do not think a certain way, you will absolutely get eviscerated. And it's crazy. It's mind-boggling. So I guess, you know, is that cancel culture, you know, is that a new thing? I don't know that it is. I don't know history very well. Unfortunately, I'm embarrassed to say that, but I don't know history very well. But, you know, you could argue that there was the cancel culture that went on, obviously for the during Vietnam, you know, for those soldiers coming back that were, you know, you could argue were getting canceled by a bunch of fellow Americans. And of course, again, that's going on today. If you have an unpopular opinion, then you will get eviscerated. It's fascinating because I guess in my upbringing, I'm older than probably a lot of people listening to this. We could discuss and debate ideas, but now it really seems like, well, at least on social media, right? It goes. What do they call it? My daughter's learning all these logical fallacies. It turns into ad hominems very quickly, right? Which means, I don't know what that actually means in Latin, but what it means in English, but it's where they attack people, where they attack each other. So rather than discussing the idea, well, you know, can you explain that? Can you unpack that for me? Can you help me understand kind of your perspective, or where are you coming from, or you know, why do you think that way? Kind of give me some better understanding on why you think that way. Just those simple 4 or 5 questions right there. Help me better understand your perspective. How did you develop that perspective? Versus, oh, you're just an idiot. I can't believe you believe that. You're just a dumb American. You're just an idiot. You're what's wrong with the world, right? This is literally what I just got done reading right before doing this post. It's crazy. So in this PTSD class with all these veterans, and then there was another guy who's a special operations guy he'd been deployed like 7 or 8 times, 7 or 8 combat tours, spent 5 or 6 years deployed. And I thought, well, man, what am I doing on this PTSD class, right? I was one of those veterans that was in between wars. So my time in service was after one conflict and before the next conflict. So I never was in combat. I'm like, so what, you know, man, I don't feel like I can even hang with any of these guys in terms of my issues. And so this guy who I'm talking about this conversation, he's like, dude, you can't compare suffering, right? Suffering is suffering. And we may have all experienced it differently. Like, he's like, so what do you say that, so somebody that was abused as a child does not have as much trauma as a combat veteran, right? You can't say that, right? You can't. And I'm like, dude, that's an excellent point. And so he's like, you can't compare suffering. And so that was another great thought. You know, he's like, that's why, we need to have empathy regardless of what somebody's quote unquote suffering is, because for them, if it's suffering for them, then it's suffering for them. It may not be suffering for you, but it is suffering for them. So, and I just thought, wow, that's great perspective. So he's like, don't minimize your own suffering just because somebody you feel has had it worse than you. Again, don't judge yourself either. Don't give yourself guilt or shame because your quote unquote suffering isn't as bad as someone else. If your suffering is impacting you, it's impacting you. So I thought that was a great thought. Number 8 thought: emotions are like trying to get rid of your arm. You can't get rid of your arm. You can't get rid of your emotions. No matter how hard we try, again, me from my entire life, minus 5 years ago, stuffing, avoiding, stewing, and brooding that's been how I've lived my life in terms of emotions. Again, I've pretended that my arm doesn't exist. So I love that when he said that, I just thought that was such a powerful analogy. So for me, I've tried to pretend I don't have arms and live life without having arms. But here they are. I've got my arms right in front of me. So he said emotions are like trying to avoid or ignore your emotions is like trying to avoid or ignore the fact that you've got arms. Then let's see. So let's see. The other thing too is that, the other thought that he shared is that, our coping mechanisms, healthy or unhealthy, may have served us. So in this case, let me use unhealthy. So even though, eating, for me, eating has been one of my coping mechanisms. Positivity has been one of my coping mechanisms. People-pleasing addiction has been one of my coping mechanisms. Excuse me. So he said, again, be careful about judging your coping mechanisms. He said, maybe at one point in your life, those all served you. Maybe they helped you get through some tough times in your life. So be careful at assigning negative meaning today to those areas of your life. Now, sure, do you want to work on those, grow those, heal those areas? Absolutely. Be careful about judging yourself and heaping more guilt and shame and condemnation on your coping mechanisms if they served you at one point. And again, there's nothing wrong, obviously, with wanting to heal and turn those into healthy, productive coping mechanisms, but just don't neglect that those may have served you at some point in your life. So that's thought number 9. So that was my conversation. Just want to share that with you all. Super powerful. You can find more out about this guy. His name is Jerry Novak, PhD. Again, Dr. Jerry Novak. He has got, his website is growthandthriving.com, growthandthriving.com. If you want to hear that episode that I did with my 2 jiu-jitsu coaches from Mentor Podcast, it was episode 4, Mentor Podcast. The next episode that I'm going to drop is with my professor, Professor Marcelo Mota from Brazil, 4th degree black belt. He's been a black belt for like 18 years. Amazing. He's competed. He shares all kinds of neat, powerful, insightful life lessons from his journey through jiu-jitsu and his ups and downs and how he's overcome those things. And it's neat to hear from somebody that has achieved mastery in an area. Mastery is a concept that not many people apply nowadays and pursue nowadays. But I think it's nonetheless still incredibly valuable and important for those of us who do want to pursue mastery in different areas of our life. In fact, that was a question that we talked about today when our family went out for lunch. Was what areas of our lives do we want to have mastery in? What would be some great areas of life to develop mastery in? So growthandthriving.com is where you can find more out about Jerry. He also has 2 Facebook groups. One is called Growth and Thriving After Trauma, Growth and Thriving After Trauma. And then also he's got another one, Facebook group called Thriving Fathers Parenting After Trauma. Thriving Fathers Parenting After Trauma. Please connect with him. He's a super guy. And he's got, just as you hopefully heard today, some really neat insightful thoughts that he challenged me with that I want to spend some time chewing on, that I wanted to share with you all. Again, for those of you that want to take your emotional fitness program to the next level, please join our membership group at eqgangster.com/mafia. Thanks again for rating, reviewing, sharing, subscribing to our podcast.